I was so confident that I had the technique correct. My professor turned to me and he said, "It's not wrong, but it's not right either." And that stuck with me until this day. And quite often he does say this when we're in class learning techniques. And even as a black belt, there's still stuff that I know I can improve and I don't always get correct. It can be hard to hear sometimes when we're given the feedback that something isn't quite right and here's how we could fix it or address it. And at the same time, our world is so full of hot takes, especially in the fitness industry, that sometimes the nuance of coaching gets lost. But on this episode of Fuel Your Strength, I decided to sit down and record a short list of stuff that, if I was being brutally honest with you, I would want to tell you without worrying about hurting your feelings, things that are going to make your lifting so much better and your experience of building strength that much smoother. So that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the podcast. If you're an athletic 40-something woman who loves lifting weights, challenging yourself, and doing hard shit, the Fuel Your Strength podcast is for you. You'll learn how to eat, train, and recover smarter so you build strength and muscle, have more energy, and perform better in and out of the gym. I'm strength nutrition strategist and weightlifting coach, Steph Gaudreau. The Fuel Your Strength podcast dives into evidence-based strategies for nutrition, training, and recovery, and why, once you're approaching your 40s and beyond, you need to do things a little differently than you did in your 20s. We're here to challenge the limiting industry narratives about what women can and should do in training and beyond. If that sounds good, hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and let's go. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to Fuel Your Strength. Now, before we get into the good stuff on this episode, which is going to be some stuff that if I was, just telling it how it is, and I wanted you to avoid making a bunch of the mistakes that I'm seeing other women over 40 who are trying to get into the gym and lifting weights and building strength and muscle doing, I would just tell you these right up front. And I'm going to be doing that on this episode. But before I get into that, with the last episode, you may have noticed something different. And that is, after many years of the same theme music, we have new theme music, which I'm super excited about. And want to give a big shout out to Charlie over at the Hustle Standard for this amazing piece of music that I feel really hits at so much of the energy of this podcast, and I'm really excited about it. So hopefully you noticed that, and you're going to be also seeing or hearing, I should say, little bits of this music and other themes kind of woven through other stuff that I put out in the world as kind of an audio type of signature, if you will. So definitely keep your ears open for that as you go across social media, and you'll be able to hear that showing up in more content. And if you're liking and appreciating the show, maybe you'll consider hitting the subscribe button on your favorite streaming podcast platform. It's of course free for you, but it really does help the show. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So I have been doing this podcast now for over 10 years. I've been podcasting for almost 10 and a half years at this point. And I love the podcast as a medium because we get to really dive into topics in more depth, and we get to explore things in context with all the context and all of the nuance that goes beyond anything that really any typical social media post can provide. So other content creators, coaches like myself, we're always trying to figure out how do we, grab people's attention in such a short time frame, 3 seconds or less, those sorts of things. And it's stressful as fuck to try to figure that out, since everything around is always shifting as well. Suffice to say, what we see a lot on social media are these really punchy ideas, hooks, etc., that are meant to kind of provoke a response, a reaction, get you to go, oh yeah, that's me. How does she know she's in my head? Or I don't agree with that. And then you kind of go into, the comment or the caption and read a little bit more, or maybe you do agree with it. So we have this idea that social media, especially short form content like YouTube shorts and Reels and TikTok and all of that stuff, is really there to kind of give you a little taster, and that this more in-depth content comes from places like a podcast like this, or a newsletter, which I have a few times a week, or something like a longer YouTube video that explores something in depth. And a lot of times I go back and forth in this battle with my brain where I am somebody who thinks the nuance, the context is extremely important. And I'm forever kind of holding back a little bit or just trying to not go into detail on things like social media posts because it's very hard to deliver the entirety of what I want to say. So that's why I really rely on the podcast and why I've really come to value it. And I am the type of person that wants to have people leave my social media feeling inspired, right? Okay, I know that it's not too late. I know I can build strength or build muscle at any age. I feel that this is really powerful and positive. And I'm not the type of person who likes to harp on all of the, the hot takes and things like that. But on this episode, I am going to kind of get into some punchier things, some sort of like hot takes that if I was less worried about hurting anybody's feelings, I would just be a lot more upfront about in a sort of tell it like it is way, because I want you to get the most out of your time and effort when you do decide I am going to get into the gym and do a program. So that stuff is hard for me to put on social media because I feel like I need to explain it in detail so people don't walk away and go, "Oh, fuck her. She doesn't get it. She doesn't understand. That was rude," or something like that. And that's not my intention at all. But on this episode, I want to get into 5 things that I see happening a lot and then give space to discuss them a little bit. And so this is a take on a post I did at the time of this recording, but when this comes out, it'll be a few weeks after the fact and go into a little bit more detail. All right, so let's start with the first thing I would tell you if I was less worried about hurting your feelings is that it's time to pick up the next heaviest set of dumbbells or add another 5 to 10 pounds to the bar. So let's get into this. As a coach and somebody who has worked with people for well over a decade in lifting, including in person and through online virtual programming, one of the biggest challenges that people have is loading their weights appropriately. Now, there's something really powerful and positive to be said about auto-regulation. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, things like rate of perceived exertion or reps in reserve, and why auto-regulation is really powerful, especially for women who are lifting and you're over 40, because how we feel on the day-to-day can become a little bit more unpredictable. So there is value in that. And even when I was coaching in Olympic weightlifting in person, there were still times where I would work with lifters. I'd be on the floor watching people doing their snatches and cleans and accessory work and noticing that they could go a little bit heavier, right? So sometimes we get into a bit of a rut where we hold back and we get really comfortable with the weights that we're lifting. Now, on the flip side, it doesn't mean we're always going to progress every single week. And I think that that's something I want to cover in the near future as a topic. And I recently did a couple stories on, because people are like, "Oh, what happens if I'm plateaued for a week or 2 weeks?" So we need to sometimes zoom out a bit more and look at the big picture. But suffice to say, a lot of my lifters then and now, when I look through especially accessory work, so that's all of the supporting exercises beyond the main lifts, oftentimes those get underloaded for a long period of time. So it's really common, and this is true of myself as well, that when left to my own devices, and when most people are left to their own devices, they're going to underload their accessory work, and even sometimes in the main lifts. Now, yes, we don't need to push ourselves to a level 10 out of 10 every day and work to absolute failure. And we've talked about that on the podcast before, but I do think there is something to be said about trying the next set of dumbbells up from where you've currently been working, especially if you've been at that weight for a few weeks. Try the next heaviest set. Maybe it's too heavy, but you can always go back down. I think in a lot of cases, you would surprise yourself. And that's what I see quite often with my lifters, is that they think, "Oh, well, this is as much as I can do." And they have gotten a bit comfortable with the weights. And so we just don't want to fall into a pattern where we keep holding back. Now, sometimes we'll progress by adding reps. That's absolutely true. There are other ways to progress a workout besides repetitions or sets, total volume, and weight. There's lots of other ways that we can progress. But those are the two simplest ones that we often come back to. So suffice to say, if you've been kind of lingering around the same weights for a while, try adding a little bit of weight. It doesn't mean you have to go pick up an extra 20-pound dumbbells, go to the next setup. Or if you're working with barbell stuff, then try, I don't know, for upper body, 2.5 to 5 pound increases, or for lower body, 5 to 10 pound increase, and see what happens. See what happens. You're doing things in a very controlled way, right? You're in the gym. You can always put the weight back down if it's too much, but oftentimes you'll surprise yourself, and this is going to get you to your goal a lot faster when we pull back and look at the big picture, rather than getting into a rut with how much weight we're picking up on the week. So try to challenge yourself, pick up the next heaviest dumbbells, or add weight to the bar. Don't keep stalling out, and you're going to see things moving in the right direction. All right, second thing I would tell you is that program hopping is the reason you're not seeing progress. Program hopping means I'm going from, I'm going to do this for 3 weeks, and then I'm going to go over here, and I saw this person do something on, Instagram for a couple weeks. They had free workouts. Then I'm going to go over here and do this. Then I'm going to go over here and do that. And you keep hopping from program to program to program, and you never settle in long enough to see forward progress because everything is always changing. The caveat here is if you've gotten on a program that is obviously not a good fit for you, then sure, pick something else. But I see a lot with folks in this stage of life. Again, if you've moved beyond just I'm just trying to move my body and I'm in that phase, which I've also talked about multiple times on this podcast, is like, that's totally fine if that's where you're at. But if you actually have goals to make meaningful progress in these areas, you're spending a decent amount of time, money, effort, right? You want to get good results. You want to get better results, right? You don't want to keep lingering in this land of like nothing's really improving. So program hopping and moving from thing to thing to thing to thing because you feel bored or it's the flavor of the month or something like that is not helping. Programming, especially good quality programming, is going to take you beyond just 3 months. And this is one of the reasons why back in the day, I did have 3-month programs, and I found a lot of people would get to the end and they'd say, well, what's next? And I was like, what is next? And there are a lot of programs out in the world that are 4 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks, and then they kind of stop. And then you're left thinking, well, what now? You're barely settling in at 4 to 8 weeks. Truly, right? We're thinking about longer term programming here. This is not just a flash in the pan. It's not a quick fix. We know this stuff is important. It's not just to, get snatch our waists for a cruise we're going on or a class reunion or something. We were really in it for the long haul. And I know that's why you're here. We have to think about the programming being longer term and the programming fitting together. So if I'm hopping from this person's free YouTube 30-day thing to then something wildly different and I'm just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, it's going to make it a lot harder for me to see continuous progress that makes sense. It's progressed in a way that makes sense. The pieces go together and it's moving you forward. So that's a big one. Again, if you're just trying to get active and do your thing, that's totally fine. But if you're somebody who's like, well, wait, why am I not seeing a lot of meaningful muscle growth? Or I'm really not seeing my strength improving much past the first couple months. It's oftentimes because you're not practicing the movements enough, or you're doing stuff that's wildly different and you don't have time to practice the skills to actually get better. So try not to program hop. Again, if you haven't quite found the right fit yet, that makes sense. But you've got to resist the urge to think this is boring. It's not changing up enough. Realistically, we should be sort of 4 to 8 weeks with the same exercises before we keep moving them around. Certain people will go longer. It just depends. But if a program is changing the exercises every single week and it's like no repeats, we're doing stuff different all the time, it's not going to give you a great crack at progressive training in the long term. Cardio, maybe. If you're not training for a cardio event or something, then sure, mix up your programming there. But it's really difficult when you're program hopping with strength training. Okay, thirdly is this idea that if you want to look sculpted or toned or have shaped muscle or long and lean muscle that you're going to have to train in a very proprietary way, a very specific way for that thing. And I understand why coaches, trainers, etc., may use this language in their social media or when they're talking to clients, because it's oftentimes the words that clients are using, right? I want to look sculpted, I want to look toned, etc. I guess I ask my dear friend, at what point do coaches and trainers and those of us who are trying to educate and create better, more intelligent dialogue in this space, at what point do we sort of also make the bridge between, hey, you might say sculpted or toned, and what that means is XYZ, and then explain in a general sense how this stuff works. Hey, if we want to look toned, then what that means is we have to build muscle size, and muscle can only shrink or grow, right? It shrinks if we don't apply a stimulus. It grows if we do, and we're able to recover from that. We're moving forward in positive adaptation. So where we get a little bit lost is that people think, okay, well, I'm just going to do this program where it was promised me I'm going to look toned, or I'm going to do stuff that doesn't really even include resistance training and it's going to tone my muscle. And then shockingly, that program doesn't deliver. Of course, it doesn't deliver because it was never designed to deliver hypertrophy or muscle building. And so you think, oh, this strength training thing is such a waste of time. I didn't actually see any improvement. And by the way, to see meaningful gains in terms of muscle growth or hypertrophy, we're talking in the order of at least a few months, probably more likely in the 6 to 12 month range if we want a difference that's very noticeable, where other people are going to say, oh, have you been doing something different in your program? That sort of thing. So this is a longer process. It's not going to be 4 weeks to sculpt your blah, blah, blah arms. I see this kind of marketing all of the time. And frankly, there are a lot of coaches out there. I think you're full of shit and you're not giving people the type of programming that's actually going to be realistic and get them that result. So then they turn around and say, strength training didn't work. This didn't work for me. And then they stop altogether, which we don't want. So I wish there was just a bit more honesty in this from the coaching training aspect. Professionals who are in the space, at least lead your client or the potential client to the bridge to understanding the common language and what that really means in terms of training. If you're somebody who's a lifter or you want to get in the gym and you want to change this appearance, you have to understand that we need two elements. We need to add muscle size, quote unquote, shape, tone, sculpting the muscle. And potentially, if there's more body fat on top of that, maybe shifting some of that so that more of the shape of the muscle comes through. Now, obviously, there are things to consider here with nutrition, with the training itself, and so on. But suffice to say, you want to look for a program that is talking about building muscle. We can't continue to have this idea of being so scared to build muscle bulk, because that's just not something you're going to do by casually lifting a few times a week. It's usually something that has to happen through extremely dedicated, very hard training, and oftentimes with assistance from things like performance enhancing substances, especially if we're talking about women. So the average person who's trying to get into the gym, even hobbyist athletes, you want to add some muscle mass, you're not going to walk out after 6 months of lifting and people are going to go, whoa, my God, you're so bulky. No, it's not going to happen. Okay. And if it does, and you feel like you've gotten more bulky, because I had somebody tell me this recently, well, I feel like I got more bulky because of lifting. It's oftentimes because there was a change in body composition with body fat, and that had an added effect. So I know this is complicated. Fat loss is not my thing that I coach, but I want to put it out there so we're at least more clear on what's going on here, right? Muscle doesn't sculpt or tone or shape in some magical way. It's either built or we're going to lose it, right? So it grows or it shrinks. And the way to really get a quote unquote toned look, at least in terms of the gym, is by doing a progressive program that includes, yes, hypertrophy. So muscle building. All right. So hopefully that gives a little bit more clarity on that aspect. And coaches, please do a better job educating people on this. You know, I get it. Your business, you have to run your business your way. But man, some of the stuff I see on Instagram reels or whatever, it just kind of makes me shudder a little bit that we're still talking about spot toning and things like that. Fourth on our list of 5 things that I would tell you if I was a little less worried about hurting people's feelings, and now I have the place to kind of explain and go into more detail, is there's a good chance you're far too focused on scale weight at the expense of everything else. Everything else. And in the past couple weeks, I've had multiple inquiries from people telling me the exact number of pounds that they need to shift on the scale. And these people are not competing in a weight class sport, which I always say with a little asterisk is its own set of circumstances. But we're talking about people that are trying to build their athleticism in general, trying to get stronger in the gym, lift, be stronger for their hobbies, the things that they love to do, etc. So as I just mentioned in the previous point that I covered, I don't go down the path of talking a lot about intentional fat loss on this podcast because primarily making nutrition changes is very tricky for a lot of people. And oftentimes there are layers of stuff that have to be peeled back. And sometimes people also need to work with a therapist on some of the underlying issues that are potentially leading them to a disordered relationship with food. So suffice to say all of that. But oftentimes I will get people that say, I need to shift the scale by X number of pounds. And you're so focused on this scale weight that you start to see declines in other things, your energy levels, how you're feeling, how you're performing. All of that stuff starts to shift in a potentially negative direction, sleep quality, etc. And it's like pushing for the scale all the time instead of pulling back and saying, okay, well, maybe I'm looking at, for example, you know, how my clothes fit. But even that, if we're building some muscle, sometimes our clothes fit differently because we're building more muscle. I used to be a high school teacher. I was a teacher for 12 years. I used to wear, you know, business casual stuff to school. And I had a lot of very tailored kind of cap sleeve blouses. And then I started strength training and those blouses all got too tight on my biceps and I couldn't wear them anymore. So even using the idea of, we'll go based on how your clothes fit can be tricky because maybe your arms grow because your arms were smaller before and now you've added muscle mass to your arms. So I just want to bring this up to say that oftentimes people can get a bit narrow on their view of what is progress. And the scale is potentially one thing in amongst a tool of many things that you should be looking at and considering. And for some of you, it's not a great idea to even focus on the scale based on where you are and working on, say, for example, your relationship to food, exercise, etc. But it is a tool. It does not tell the whole entire picture. And I've just seen far too many times people continuing to take things to an unhealthy place because they were so focused on the exact number on the scale, or they were comparing to, well, when I was 25 and now you're 50 or you're 45 and your life is very different now. So don't get so narrowly focused on the scale at the expense of everything else that other things start to decline in terms of quality of health, quality of life experience, performance, and so on and so forth. And I've done some episodes in the past on things like REDS and have had some great guests on to talk about things like REDS. And I highly recommend you go back and check out those episodes if you feel like that's something that would be supportive to you there. All right, last but not least on this short list of stuff I'd tell you, if I was a little bit less worried about hurting people's feelings, because here I have the context to expand, would be that DIY isn't free and everything comes at a cost. So this idea comes from the many, many, many times I get contacted about the Strong with Steph program. I'll get emails or messages in my DMs. And one of the things that I will ask is, what kind of strength training experience do you have? Because I'm trying to figure out, and we'll be covering this in a episode coming soon, how to tell if you're more beginner, intermediate, or advanced with lifting. But I'll usually start by asking a question similar to that to try to gauge roughly how much experience somebody has. Have you lifted before? How long? And quite oftentimes I'll hear from people that they've been lifting for some degree of time. Oftentimes it's 6+ months they've been lifting by making up their own workouts. And again, this is not the scenario I touched on earlier, which is somebody is just trying to get moving. You don't have a lot of focused goals. You're not trying to improve in a particular area. You're more casual with things because you're potentially more on the ultra beginner side. Although I even think that beginners could and should get on a program that's beginner level because it's going to teach you a lot of great things right up front. Suffice to say, I hear from a lot of people that say, I've been lifting for a long time. And I'll say, okay, cool. How is it going? And they'll say, terrible. And I say, well, tell me more. What does that mean? And they'll say, well, I've been lifting for a long time, but making stuff up on my own. And, they're not seeing good progress anymore. So I know that there are tons of people who are voracious listeners of this podcast and probably others. You read all the social media posts, you share or save those posts in your bookmarked tab on Instagram. You're like, I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to learn about progressive overload and learn how to structure a week of training. And there's nothing wrong with learning the idea behind it. And I'm a huge proponent of education. That is a core value of my business and what I do, and my own personal core value, which shouldn't surprise most of you that I was a teacher. So education, very, very important. But at the end of the day, most of you don't have the resources of time to really sit down and study how good programming works. So good programming seems simple on the surface, but when it comes time to change the variables of a program and continue to move things forward, it's very hard to do that for ourselves. Have you ever looked at yourself in the mirror? And this is top of mind because I'm going for one of these tomorrow, but you've looked at yourself in the mirror and you think, oh my gosh, how did my hair get that long since my last haircut? What the heck? Because we see ourselves every day, and it's a lot harder sometimes to spot things objectively in ourselves. So you see your hair every day, so you're not even noticing that a couple months goes by and you've grown an inch of hair, or 6 months goes by and your hair is a few inches longer. I feel like the same thing applies to making up your own program. It's easy to think at first, okay, well, I'll do this. Okay, well, I'll do that. And then inevitably, it gets harder to progress the workouts over time, or you get stuck for ideas and you kind of end up getting into a rut, or you're having a hard time learning to include flexibility within the structure and those sorts of things. And it's harder to spot areas where you might be plateauing, right? Because again, we're not as proficient. It's not as easy for us to step back. And even coaches have coaches. Strength training coaches and personal trainers have their own coaches and trainers. Quite often because we're doing this for other people and we're just like normal people as well, it's harder for us to assess ourselves. So this is the idea here that if you're trying to make up all of your own workouts for yourself, things are definitely not moving in a good direction, then I want you to think about what that cost is, right? So their idea that we can just make it up for ourselves and it's free, it doesn't cost anything, isn't quite true, right? There is always a cost to the time that it takes for us to think about it. Or maybe the cost is that on days we get overwhelmed because it's a really busy work week and we have to call for the vet appointment for the cat and we've got to pick up the car because it had an oil change, and all of these things are competing for our capacity and our attention. It gets a lot more overwhelming to make up your own workouts. There's much less brain space required to open the workout that's been written already and follow through. So everything has a cost, even when we're trying to do something on our own. And we sometimes don't think of it that way. I remember when my ex and I bought a house, and it had some things that had to be fixed up. And one of the things we decided to do was, never did this in my life, lay a tile floor. Not only a small room, a big ass room. And we had to remove all of the existing flooring, prepare the floor, get all the materials, rent the saw and all of the other stuff that we had to use. I think at one point we had to get a jackhammer to remove some of the existing tile. And there was also linoleum. So I was scraping for hours to get that flooring up so we could move on with the tile job. We had to rent the saw, all of the equipment, everything. And learn as we go and hopefully not mess it up. And there were definitely mistakes that were made. And at the end of the day, yes, quote unquote, there was money saved. But what we had to account for was it took a lot of time. There were definitely mistakes that we paid for in the end because the floor had some irregularities. And of course, nothing is 100% perfect, but it could have been done more professionally, of course. And neither of us had experience in actually putting down a tile floor. So we were spending time learning as we were going. So I'm not here to say that DIY home improvement projects are a bad idea, but when we're considering the costs associated with doing everything ourselves, there are other costs that are included, right? So if you're trying to do your own home improvement projects, you might be saving money up front, but if you make a mistake, then you have to also pay to fix it, pay a professional to fix it if it's a bad enough mistake. It's the time, the effort, etc. that goes into it. So I want you to think about if you've been making up your own strength training, it's been a while, you know that you're not really making a lot of forward progress. I want you to consider getting on a strength training program. Now, it doesn't have to be working with a personal trainer. It doesn't have to be Strong with Steph, although I would love to have you check it out. You can check out a free week at stephgaudreau.com/workout, but get on a program. Because you're going to save so much brain space. You're going to have the peace of mind that there's workout. It's already waiting for you. When you're exhausted and tired at the end of the day and you're like, oh my God, I just can't think of anything else. And if left to your own devices, it'll sound so much more appealing to go home and crash out on the couch or scroll on social media or things like that, right? In those moments, if you had a program written down for you, it would be so much easier to open that program and do something really positive for yourself instead of succumbing to the brain rot that happens when we're overwhelmed. And then adding an extra thing to your plate is like, oh my gosh, I just can't deal. So consistency is important, right? Time is of the essence. It's important that we get a good start or that we're seeing some forward progress on our programming. All right. So that's been this episode running through this list of things that sound like hot takes, but there is a lot of context and nuance to it. So we talked about picking up the next heaviest weight and giving it a try. We talked about not program hopping anymore. So stick to one thing for long enough that you start to see good progress. We talked about the idea behind sculpting and toning, and that's really building muscle. So we want to keep our eyes focused on that. We covered a narrow focus on scale weight and why that can come at the expense of other things in your training. And then lastly, why DIYing isn't free because everything comes at a cost. So it's important to get on a program so that you're more consistent in the long run. I do say these things with a ton of compassion and care because I want you to get the most out of your efforts with the least amount of frustration and time wasted. As I said in a recent show, we have this paradox where it's never too late to get started or it's never too late to make progress. But also the more time goes by, the more we're going to have to make up ground. So the sooner we can start, the better. With that in mind, if you want to check out, as I said, a week of Strong with Steph, you can do that at stephgaudreau.com/workout. And if you're appreciating the show, maybe you'll consider hitting the subscribe button. It's free for you, but it really does help to spread the word about the show so that other like-minded folks with similar interests can find it. All right, that does it for this episode. And until next time, you know how we do it. Stay strong.